Hello and welcome to Lowy Institute Conversations. My name is Lydia Khalil, Director of the Transnational Challenges Program and host of today's episode. The Five Eyes is a powerful and strategically important intelligence alliance. Its member countries, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, gather and share intelligence on a global scale. Like many such Western alliance arrangements, the Five Eyes was forged out of World War II, where code breakers across the Atlantic worked together to decrypt German and Japanese military codes, providing a decisive advantage in the war. It's one of the world's most unified multilateral arrangements, one that has been jealously guarded and protected by its 5 country members for over 75 years. Many countries have sought to become a part, arguing for a Five Eyes Plus arrangement, but so far, none have broken into this exclusive club. It's an intelligence alliance that's marked by its endurance and influence, but even the Five Eyes has not managed to avoid the alliance wrecking ball that it's the second Trump administration. For this episode, we're taking a look at this issue from 2 different perspectives, insider and informed expert. I first speak to Ambassador Dennis Richardson, who is former director of ASIO and who held a number of prominent appointments, including Australian ambassador to the United States, knows the Five Eyes intimately. Next, I'll be speaking to the Institute's own Dan Flitton, who you all know as editor of The Interpreter, but who also covered national security and intelligence throughout his long career as a journalist, and who worked for the then Australian Office of National Assessments, which is now known as the Office of National Intelligence, ONI, earlier in his career. I first begin by speaking with Ambassador Richardson. Ambassador Richardson, welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Lydia.
I was hoping that I can first ask you to give us a bit of context about the Five Eyes. Can you give us a sense of how this intelligence alliance works?
Initially, in the 50s and 60s, revolved around very much counter-espionage and the like, the Soviet bloc. There are also arrangements involving the National Security Agency of the US, the Defence Signals Director of Australia and the like, other arrangements relating to other forms of intelligence sharing. Since the late 90s, the heads of all those agencies have come together on a fairly regular basis. It's very open, it is very frank, very informal, and works in terms of intelligence sharing literally on a day-to-day basis.
We say it's intelligence sharing, but can you give us a sense of what exactly that means? So is the intelligence that's gathered and shared, is that raw intelligence, for example, or is that after it's been analyzed and contextualized, or is it a bit of both?
It is both.
Which is pretty unusual, right? Because not often that you have intelligence agencies sharing raw intelligence, correct?
That is right, but the Five Eyes certainly does.
Can you give us an example, to the extent that you can, maybe one further back in history, so we don't get in trouble with classifications and stuff, about the Five Eyes in action, or maybe give us an example of a time where that arrangement has provided an advantage or protected Australia from a threat that it wouldn't otherwise have known if Australia was only relying on its own intelligence assets or capabilities?
There have been instances where people in other countries have been alerted to potential assassination attempts. There have been instances, certainly after 9/11, where intelligence was shared that unquestionably saved Australian lives. And of course, during a military conflict in which you're involved with at least some of your or all of your Five Eyes partners, such as in Afghanistan, then their lives, military lives, are being saved on a daily basis. The intelligence is shared on a daily basis, so it's factoring into your information, your briefings, and your decision-making all the time.
Yeah, and I suppose the point that you're trying to make as well, too, is that it's just so intimately interwoven in day-to-day functioning, right, of all of those countries' intelligence gathering and analysis. It's almost like you can't unpick it apart or unpick necessarily one example.
It is interwoven into the daily activity of the 5 countries. We have people from each of the intelligence agencies seconded into the agencies of our Five Eyes partners and vice versa. It is a very close, intimate relationship regarding information sharing.
We've said that Five Eyes is the preeminent example of the alliance structure that's benefited its membership under the U.S. leadership. We know that the Trump administration has demonstrated time and time again that it's not really interested in maintaining U.S. leadership over this global alliance structure that it's set up. And it has a generally transactional view of relationships. But at this term, the treatment of allies is not only transactional, but outright hostile in a lot of instances. And here I'm thinking about the deterioration of the U.S.-Canada relationship, which I don't know what you think about it, but it seems particularly shocking even by Trump administration standards. You not only have the tariffs imposed on Canada, despite it being one of the largest trading partners, you've got talks of annexing Canada as the 51st state. And now we even have reports of U.S. advisor to President Trump, Peter Navarro, has called for Canada to be kicked out of the Five Eyes, though it should be acknowledged that he denied saying this.
Peter Navarro could say what he likes about the Five Eyes arrangements. He would have zero influence in terms of decisions which would be as significant and as great, as far-reaching as kicking one country out.
Again, we should acknowledge that he did deny saying it, even though it was publicly reported. But I suppose to the broader point, this isn't an alliance structure that is so tied to trust. I mean, all alliance structures are, but particularly one based on intelligence sharing. How can this go on when you've got one country threatening to annex another and they're supposedly trusting each other with really sensitive intelligence?
The intelligence sharing arrangements are kept separate to the day-to-day ebb of political theatre and also differences in other areas. I don't believe that any of the current intelligence sharing arrangements between the Five Eyes partners would be negatively affected at this point by anything the Trump administration has said or done.
And it should be said it's not the first time there's been tensions among the Five Eyes countries, right? Either matters of politics or matters of strategy, and the alliance has weathered those.
Oh, well, very much so. Take New Zealand in the early 1980s, when they effectively refused to allow the entry into New Zealand ports of US military nuclear ships. That effectively caused an enormous political fallout between the US and New Zealand, but it didn't lead to New Zealand being kicked out of Five Eyes. The UK wasn't involved in Vietnam. Canada was quite critical of the US-led invasion of Iraq. None of those differences negatively affected the intelligence sharing arrangements. This is a very strong partnership, and you need to understand that for a transactional president, it's not hard to demonstrate the transactional benefits of the intelligence sharing across the board. It's not just US sharing intelligence with its partners, it's New Zealand, Australia, Canada and UK sharing intelligence with the US. So it is, if you like, it's a transactionally based arrangement. It fits into some of Trump's concept of relationships quite well.
Because by its very nature, the implication is that it's a transactional relationship arrangement anyway.
Yes, and quite obviously the US would probably share more than what it gets. However, that's not to underestimate the importance of what it gets. You can't measure intelligence simply in terms of quantity. You must also look at quality. So it would surprise me if this arrangement were to come under serious challenge during a Trump presidency.
How concerned would you be about the politicization of intelligence coming out of the U.S.? So, for example, the last Director of National Intelligence DNI assessment recently came out, and some have argued that that assessment has reflected more of Trump's priorities rather than necessarily an objective analysis of the threat environment. But setting that aside, the Trump administration has been clear that it's intent on purging what it calls the deep state, essentially the government bureaucrats and intelligence and law enforcement officials who make it function, and it has been hostile to the intelligence community. So how concerned should we be about that and about potential politicization?
Sharing intelligence is different to necessarily sharing assessments. You can certainly swap, as we do, our assessments of different situations and different challenges, but that doesn't mean that you share the same views as your intelligence partners. That has always been the case. And in today's environment, there is obviously, or should be, a premium placed upon independent analysis and independent assessments. That has always been the case. So we start from a pretty strong place. The US has never, in my view, insisted that we share whatever judgment they might make about a particular situation. Indeed, at meetings of the heads of intelligence agencies that I've been at, there has often been robust discussions about how one might read a political situation.
So that's an important point of distinction. So, but even though intelligence is shared, it's not necessarily means that we have to have similar assessments. There was also another recent incident around the sharing of intelligence and sensitive information that made headlines, where you had senior Trump administration officials, including National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, the DNI. They were discussing and sharing highly sensitive information about military strikes against Houthis in Yemen over Signal, which is a commercial messaging app, and that a journalist was inadvertently added to that group chat. They received a lot of criticism for that, for this kind of reckless attitude toward operational security. So for allies, how concerned should we be about how U.S. administration top officials handle secret information that we share with them via the alliance?
There's been bigger issues than that in the past. We've actually had people arrested and charged in different countries for spying. You look at the Ames case over 25 years ago. You look at cases like that. They ultimately posed much bigger challenges than this. Quite obviously, eyebrows are raised when something like this happens. But again, it created its own political dynamic in the US and in the US Congress. So I suspect there was a self-correcting mechanism there.
Well, I suppose I'll just close with this question to you. There have been so many things, I think, taken for granted that can no longer, like the US's commitment to its global leadership. Now, you've come out pretty decisively, I think, in our conversation, saying that you think that the Five Eyes intelligence arrangements is still quite strong, that it will endure. But if we're thinking about contingencies, what do you think that the Australian intelligence community, or in fact the broader national security community, should be either thinking about, preparing for, developing additional capabilities for as a plan B or even a plan C?
I've often said, I think the notion that governments walk around with plan Bs and plan Cs, I think is a bit, most organisations don't. Today, it's self-evident that the United States is a less reliable ally today than what it was a year ago. I've stated that publicly before, and I think that's an unremarkable statement. It's simply a statement of fact. However, I think it would be a big mistake. There's a difference between knowing that your major ally is less reliable than what was previously, a difference between that and unilaterally walking away from the alliance. And it would be a big mistake to unilaterally walk away from it. The intelligence sharing arrangement is a particular part of the overall relationship. It's probably that part of the relationship that has been most intimate and intense. And I think it would take a lot to, in fact, rock it and put it off course. You can't entirely ignore that possibility, but I would be enormously surprised if we got to that point, and I wouldn't have thought sensible people would at this point be looking at plan Bs because it may happen. And indeed, if it did happen, we wouldn't be in a position to replace all the capability that we get through other Five Eyes partners, particularly the US. And I note that the US walked away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, not in intelligence, trade-related, and the Australian government and the Japanese government simply continued on and put it together without the US. I'd be very surprised if the Five Eyes intelligence sharing arrangements were terminally damaged by virtue of the Trump administration.
Ambassador Dennis Richardson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Lydia.
I'm now joined by my colleague Dan Flitton, a keen observer of intelligence matters. Dan also recently published a piece in The Interpreter on the potential politicization of intelligence analysis by the Trump administration. Hi, Dan. Thanks for joining me.
You're welcome. Hi, Lydia.
I wanted to get to this point about the risk of intelligence politicization under the Trump administration. But first, I want to ask you, as I did Dennis, if you think that the Trump administration's attitude toward the alliance and U.S. leadership of alliances extends to the Five Eyes.
Oh, I think undoubtedly so. We've seen in the last few months since the inauguration, there's already been murmurings in the United Kingdom about the reliability of American secrets, particularly after Trump turned off the tap for sharing intelligence with the Ukraine. There was talk about kicking Canada out of the Five Eyes Club over the trade disputes, although that was quickly denied by the White House. But it seemed to be a sign that nothing was off limits. So I think that for Australia, it just means that with the Trump changes, that we need to be reading US intelligence product with much greater care.
And that gets to your recent article about the latest DNI assessment. Now, DNI, for listeners, is the Directorate of National Intelligence. It's the head of the U.S. national intelligence community that is responsible for publishing regular assessments on national security matters. And in your article, you've brought up some concerns with the latest DNI assessment that came out, namely that the administration might be politicizing some of its assessments. Can you talk us through some of your concerns?
This assessment that you're talking about, this is an annual threat assessment which is required under law in the United States. And it was released in March. And the aim of this is to get all the compiled US intelligence agencies together, drawing on both the secret and publicly available sources to chart the serious threats that the United States is facing in the year ahead. And what was sudden and a bit suspicious about the latest assessment that was released this year is the way in which you can compare it to last year's and how all of a sudden it matches, the latest version matches Trump's worldview about the impending dangers. So in the 2024 report, it began with the threat that China poses, Russia, Iran, state actors. The 2025 version turns these issues on its head. This year, it's fentanyl, drugs cartels, Islamic extremists, illegal immigration. They all top the list. Now, there's no prizes there for guessing who remembers the priorities that Trump campaigned on during the presidential election last year. The threat of state actors is still prominently canvassed in the report, but to give you an example of the way in which things have shifted subtly in this latest version, in 2024, the report singled out, and this was a quote, Russia's ongoing aggression in Ukraine. Now, that quote, ongoing aggression, that doesn't appear in the 2025 report, but in 2024, they posed it as a danger to the rules-based international order. But this year, in a subtle shift, the intelligence agencies conclude now that instead of the Russia-Ukraine war posing a risk to the rules in the world, it poses a strategic risk to the United States about being drawn into a wider conflict. Now, why does that matter? It's because of the way in which the intelligence suggests a policy response. And the ideal of intelligence is to keep it separated from policy decision-making. The ideal is that intelligence analysts should be calling the world as they see it, not affected by how they expect it to be received by the policymakers. And I think that with this latest report, you can see these subtle shifts in the way in which this intelligence is being presented.
Okay, so there seems to be some sort of implication in that the reversal of some of the ordering in terms of what threats are identified are more attuned to or sensitive of the policy needs of the Trump administration rather than, say, just like an objective, flat-out strategic assessment of intelligence.
So another really good example is Greenland. Greenland doesn't appear at all in the 2024 threat assessment. But suddenly this year, in the 2025 threat assessment, there's words that say China's long-term goal is to expand access to Greenland's natural resources and to use the territory to gain a foothold in the Arctic. We know that Donald Trump has designs on Greenland for what he says are national security considerations. Now, it's not that intelligence agencies should ignore the issues that are on the minds of policymakers. The point is more that their job is not to tailor their assessments to what the president wants to hear, because that tendency in the worst case can lead to instances like the mistaken assumptions that were made in the lead up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq about Saddam's weapons of mass destruction.
This isn't the first time that we've seen this happen, so it's not necessarily exclusive to the Trump administration, right?
No, it's not. There are other examples that have become public in recent weeks that do suggest that the intelligence agencies in the United States are maintaining a robust independence in the face of what the administration might prefer. So there's been a lot of focus on the prison gangs and this threat that's supposedly come from Venezuela. And there's been reporting, I think it was in the Washington Post, saying that the intelligence community has concluded that the Venezuelan government's not directing an invasion of the United States. So I wouldn't want to leave the impression that everything is being skewed by the administration. I think that this particular report that we began with, the threat assessment, is a peculiar one in the sense that it does go through the hands of the DNI, who is a Trump appointment, and there is a risk that the presentation of that sort of intelligence may be skewed to fit the preferences of the president. But there are still examples that you can point to where the agencies are saying, no, this is the way we see it. That's different from what the policymakers might be arguing publicly.
Right. Well, I do want to ask you about the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard. But before I do, let's just stay with this point for a little longer. So this seems to be, whether there is politicization or not of the assessments and to what degree, this seems to be a matter mostly for the United States, right? So what are the implications for the Five Eyes? Should this matter to the Five Eyes Alliance? You know, we share intelligence, we exchange our assessments of that intelligence, but we don't necessarily have to share or come to a consensus around intelligence assessments. So does it have any broader implications for the Five Eyes?
It does. I mean, certainly within the Five Eyes, even though they do share top secret material, there are still secrets that even within the partnership are so jealously guarded that they only keep them for themselves. And it's not a secret to know that ASIO, for example, is a classification which is stamped on some reports that are intended for Australian eyes only. And there's a US version, there's a UK version, Kiwi version, Canadian version. They do hold things from one another. But it does matter in this case because of the preponderance of information that comes from the United States that flows through the system. So to give you an example, I mean, there's a difference between, we're going to just draw a distinction here between intelligence and intelligence assessment and intelligence collection. But there is a lot of US material that flows through the system, and the sharing of that information is based on trust that the information that's being presented is being presented in as straightforward a matter of fashion as is possible. And otherwise, there is this idea that intelligence is not so much to inform, but to influence a perspective. And if everybody's sort of working off the same data set, then they're going to start to see the world in much the same sort of way. And I think that that's a big part, and an often unacknowledged part, of the reason why the United States in particular, but all of the countries, are so willing to share their intelligence at such a high level, is because they want their partners to see the world in the way in which they do. But Australia and the other Five Eyes partners should be realistic that there is a risk in this moment that the intelligence, particularly the assessments, might be being skewed to fit the agenda of the Trump administration. I think the only thing that they can do there is make sure they are talking about it amongst themselves and cognizant about the risks that are involved.
I want to ask you now about the current National Director of Intelligence in the United States, Tulsi Gabbard. You referred to her earlier, and like many Trump appointments, she's not exactly an orthodox choice, to say the least. She's made some interesting comments in the past, particularly about people like Edward Snowden, who listeners might remember in 2013 was responsible for the release of a massive amount of NSA data, I think one of the biggest leaks in U.S. intelligence history that revealed certain things, revealed that the United States was engaged in surveillance activities against certain U.S. citizens. And she said in the past that he shouldn't have been prosecuted, that he was a whistleblower. She didn't disavow those comments during her nomination process. She's also made calls in general, for broader declassification of secrets. Now, there are many people within, the general population that might share her views, maybe some people involved in intelligence themselves, but it is pretty unusual for an intelligence chief to have those views or to praise someone or have praised someone who's been responsible for a huge intelligence leak. How do you think something like that might sit with alliance partners?
I don't get any sense that she's caused a great sense of alarm within the Five Eyes community. She was certainly very heavily welcomed when she travelled to India earlier this year, which is another country that has been spoken about in the past as perhaps one that could be welcomed into the Five Eyes. At least some enthusiastic backers of India have suggested that. And I don't think that there's any problem with somebody coming into the community with a slightly unorthodox view in terms of challenging some of the established wisdom that has been created. And she's also been a political player. She's come in with some fairly well-canvassed views. If the intelligence assessment starts to reflect her perspective and it's not been backed up by good evidence, that would be more of an alarm. But I don't think that the individual himself I don't think that that's going to set off the other Five Eyes members.
Well, Dan, thanks as always for your informed perspective. It's been great to talk to you about this.
My pleasure.
You've been listening to Lowy Institute Conversations. This episode was produced by Pro Podcast. You can listen to past episodes on lowyinstitute.org, on our YouTube channel, or wherever you get podcasts. Thanks for joining us. Until next time.